All right, so Tim has been working as a mental health therapist for almost 10 years and at United Action for Youth almost 4. Prior to UAY, he worked in Boston and San Francisco, serving LGBTQ youth of color. Tim has worked with many diverse communities in his professional life, including the transgender, gender nonconforming community, survivors of sexual exploitation and trafficking, people living with HIV, communities of color, and people in recovery from drugs and alcohol. So welcome, Tim, and thank you for leading our session today.
Thanks, Ellie. Thank you, all of you, for being here, Tammy and John and Shelley, and also those of you watching this asynchronously in the future. Thanks for being here. This is for you. Tammy and John, if you have questions as we go, please, it's just us. So if you want to interrupt or have things, please pop them in the chat or just speak up. It's really fine. Otherwise, I'm just going to kind of start going. And we'll go from there. So as Ellie mentioned, my name is Tim Grady. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a licensed mental health counselor working at United Action for Youth in Iowa City. UAY is a youth service organization. We've been around for, it's our 51st year in the Iowa City community. We provide mental health counseling, housing services, services for young parents, as well as a youth drop-in center in downtown Iowa City where junior high and high school students can come together for community activities, all that kind of stuff. So really a lot of services that we do. I'm on the part of the counseling team and also work with the LGBTQ programming that we offer. And so hopefully can have some insight. My perspective is often youth based. So you might see youth or student in my PowerPoint. I tried to edit it out for client, but it's all relevant. So just some specific considerations for specific populations, which we'll talk a little bit about. Great. So LGBTQ plus is the term that is currently, this evolves a little bit over time. At one time it was GLBT, we've seen LGBT, we've seen LGBTQ. LGBTQ plus is kind of what we are settled on at the moment. That will probably continue to evolve. And we are talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning, and many other identities. That's the plus. So it's an umbrella term that refers to a community of lots of different people who share either marginalized gender or sexual identities. It does not include two big things. One is varied relationship styles, so things like polyamory, non-monogamy, open relationships. Those are not specifically included in the LGBTQ umbrella because anyone of any identity can participate in those relationship styles. It also does not specifically refer to any sexual behaviors. So we're talking about BDSM or fetish communities as an example, because again, anyone of any identities can participate in those communities. I wanted to start with a little bit of why this matters right now. And that matters because we live in Iowa and we live in the United States. And right now the LGBTQ community is one of those communities that is being targeted for legislation to limit accessibility to care, accessibility to rights, along with communities of color, along with under-resourced communities, et cetera. So specifically in Iowa, these are some of the things that are limiting to our community. So for example, if you are a victim of crime as an LGBTQ person because of your identity, hate crimes protections exist for sexual orientation, but not for gender identity. So if you are a trans person who is targeted for being a trans person, that cannot be prosecuted as a hate crime in the state of Iowa. There is no law banning conversion therapy for minors. That's it's like a debunked form of therapy to convert someone from their gender or sexual identity back to sort of something that is more heteronormative, right? There are no laws in Iowa banning panic defenses. So if someone is charged with a crime based on identity, they can say that they didn't know and they panicked, and it's basically like a defense of a temporary insanity defense. And that is largely regarded as an illegitimate form of defense, but there's no law banning it in Iowa. There are lots of bills that were proposed. This was from last legislative session, but none of these have gone into law at this point, but it's a good sampling of things that have come up in the Iowa legislature, right? Banning affirming healthcare access to transgender young people is a law that they straight up were like, we should do that. Again, these haven't passed or become law, but these are things that were being considered. Removing gender identity as a protected class in Iowa so that you are not able to receive protections that go along with that status. And upholding religious exemptions to discrimination, including adoption and foster care. So on the basis of your strongly held religious beliefs, you can discriminate against anyone based on their identity, right? The one that has, as a lot of you probably know, in March of this year, the transgender sports ban went into effect, banning trans women from participating in sex-segregated sports at every level, including college and professional. And we'll come back to that a little later on. But this is stuff that affects this is our clients that we're talking about. These are LGBTQ identified individuals that are being impacted by the laws and the legislation in our state, as well as nationally. Okay, so that's why it matters. So let's get into some language stuff. John, did you have a question? Sorry, you just lit up on my screen. Great, I'm gonna assume not. Okay, so you heard me say queer. The Q in LGBTQ is often queer. So queer is something that we consider to be a reclaimed slur. It's also used as an umbrella term. It can apply to gender or sexuality or various other combinations of identities. And it usually is used by people to indicate anything that's outside of like straight and not trans, right? So queer can apply to any of those. So if you have a client who uses the term queer, it's useful to clarify what that means for them, right? And you will hear this, especially with young people. With older populations, if you're working with older clients, there's still a lot of like bristling at the word queer for some generations, and that is because it was a slur for a long time. In the sort of academic circles and in the younger cultural circles, it's being reclaimed, but with older clients, it may not be a word that is comfortable for them. And so that's something you need to be aware of as well. I said that my name is Tim and I use he, him pronouns. Everyone uses pronouns. These are just the words that we use to refer to someone when we're not using their name, right? It's very important for people who have changed or fought for pronouns that they may not match. We all make assumptions about people and their pronouns when we talk about them, right? And that's not super helpful, but it's especially not helpful if someone, the assumptions that we make don't align with their identities. So it's very good practice to get in the habit when you are meeting new clients or even with coworkers, just to normalize introducing yourself with pronouns. And that can be led by example. Hi, I'm Tim. I use he, him pronouns. What do you use? That's a very, I do this with clients when I meet them for the first time all the time. It's very standard, it's non-threatening, and I'm leading by modeling that in the beginning. Also, just to say, pronouns are not like a woke thing. Everyone has pronouns that we use when we're like when we prefer to be talked about, right? When you leave and talk about this training, I want you to say, Tim said this, his training was this, he said da 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 da, right? It's just how I prefer to be referred to. We all have it. This is the gender unicorn. This is an infographic put out by a website called transstudent.org. They're an excellent organization that has resources targeted to young people and their families. So like primary and secondary school age students and their families. They have a ton of infographics about gender and sexuality related topics, as well as other resources. And all of it is copyright free. They're like, please go forth and use these in the world. So the gender unicorn is useful to think about LGBTQ identities that we all hold. So gender, let me just shoot. I'm looking at myself, which is probably weird, sorry. So we're breaking this down into gender identity, which you've heard me say already. This is about how we think about ourselves on the inside. When I think about myself, I imagine myself to be a man, right? The arrows on here, the idea is that all of us are on a spectrum, right? So Someone may identify as a man completely. Someone may identify as a woman completely. Someone may identify as a combination of those things. Sometimes we refer to that as non-binary, gender fluid, pangender, et cetera, et cetera. And there are some people who don't identify with a gender, and that might be referred to as agender, right? So there are A identities, agender, asexuality, and A just means the lack of. So someone may not identify with that. All of these exist on a spectrum, right? Gender expression or presentation has to do with external cues, ways that we present ourselves to other people, to the world, that align with how we want to be perceived. So this is usually, but not always, in alignment with our gender identity. And this is things like hair and makeup, clothing that we choose to use, how our tone of voice, how we move our bodies, nail polish, jewelry, these kinds of things. This has a lot to do with feminine and masculine, which is, again, a spectrum, and our sort of stereotyped terms that if you think about going into Target, there's like the men's section and the women's section, right? Can people who identify otherwise wear clothes from the women's section? Sure, but it's like a label we apply that we sort of have all agreed on. Here's the generally what we mean, right? So we're talking about gender expression and presentation. We're talking about femininity and masculinity and everything in between, right? This includes words like androgynous, which we have heard, which is often sort of like not clearly feminine or masculine, and then all the other points along the spectrum. You'll notice that in the middle is the sex assigned at birth. This is the one identity that does not have a spectrum. This is when a baby is born at birth, they are assigned a sex based on external sex characteristics, sometimes internal sex characteristics, and sometimes chromosomes. So generally we see presence of a vagina, it's a girl, presence of a penis, it's a boy. And there's a third option, intersex, and this has to do with babies who are born with incomplete formation of sex characteristics, or a combination of different chromosomes that may not be XY or XX. Intersex is the guidance used to be, when this was the case, for the parents to choose a gender to raise their baby and then see what happens. They might even do surgery on the newborn to sort of align their body more with one or the other. The guidance now and for a long time has been, as long as there's not a medical concern, sometimes there's like blockage to the urethra, so it might be hard to pee, as an example. As long as there's not a medical concern, there's no health concern to a baby who's born intersex. Raise them like a typical baby that they are, and as they get older, then the child can then tell you more about how they feel and how they identify. Again, this is something that's assigned to a kid when they're born as an infant and has nothing to do with how they might actually identify in the future. It's just about bodies. That's when we say sex, we're referring to physical body. When we say gender, we're referring to identity. The bottom two have more to do with sexuality. So we were talking about gender, now we're talking about sexuality. This is who I am attracted to. So gender is internal, sexuality kind of goes out, right? So sexually attracted to people of all different identities, men, women, other genders. Also, romantically and emotionally attracted to has much more to do with things like feelings of intimacy, feelings of safety, feelings of being able to have boundaries, those kinds of things. For many people, their romantic attractions and their sexual attractions line up. For some people, they don't. And so it's useful to recognize that just because a client you're working with has sex with people of certain genders, we might want to clarify whether that is a gender that they would be interested in having a romantic relationship with. Because some people would, many people would, some don't, and some are not interested in romantic relationships at all. That might be aromantic, as an example. Here is all of that stuff that I just sort of went through in a broken down piece that's mostly there for your reference. So when we're talking with clients, the gender unicorn is great as a reference, but we're talking about actual humans, right? Who come into us seeking services, seeking support, right? So we want to remember that identity whether it's gender, sexuality, these are considered invisible identities, right? Whereas something like race, for example, is often more visible. We can often see if someone is BIPOC from visible cues. Gender and sexuality are often not that way. Therefore, those identities are unknown to us until the person shares that identity with you. And they'll do that if it's relevant to our services, right? We want to be asking questions about things that are important to the services we're providing on a need to know basis, not on a want to know basis. That being said, we should also not be making assumptions about someone's identity, how they identify, what pronouns they use, who they date, etc. Gender expression, so the way that someone shows up with their clothing, their mannerisms, their voice, their et cetera, don't necessarily have to do with social and cultural norms. So if someone shows up and is dressed in a very feminine way, we still want to be curious about whether they identify as a woman, as an example, right? Same with sexual orientation and romantic orientation. I just mentioned this. Who someone has sex with does not necessarily always line up with who they would like to have a romantic relationship with. Often it does. Sometimes there are additional people that they might. So you might have people who are homosexual, heteroromantic, which would mean homosexual. They have sex with people of the same gender, but they're looking to have a romantic relationship with someone of a different gender, right? So those things can be different, and it's worth exploring, and it's as easy as just asking the question, and you will find that information out. Again, if that's relevant to the services that you're providing. I mentioned the sexual behavior. I want to remind us that identity and behavior are very different. Therefore, for example, I've worked with survivors of sexual exploitation, for example. I worked with a young woman who identified as a lesbian, but had had a lot of sex with male identified people that looked like straight sex. She was forced into that, but many people in her life may not have known that at the time, right? And so seeing that would make assumptions about her identity that she was a straight woman, when in fact she was a lesbian and attracted to other women, but was being forced into these situations. So we want to be curious about, there's other less sort of like coercive examples of this as well. And then intersectionality is in bold on the bottom. Intersectionality points us to the fact that people, the LGBTQ community is not a monolith. There are people with a variety of different experiences. That includes intersections of racial identity, socioeconomic status, educational background, family and veteran status, et cetera, et cetera. All of those are going to play into what a person's experiences of themselves are. And we want to be curious about that. Just because we know that someone is gay and male, if they are also a Black man, that's going to be a different experience probably than someone who is an immigrant from Sudan, for example, and has those same identities. So those things are really relevant when we're talking about these kinds of identities. No one is one thing. We're all a lot of things. All right, some more words when we're talking with our clients, right? We want to use ideally we're using the term partner or partners when we're asking clients about relationships or other dependents or family makeup, right? Because we don't want to be assuming gender of those people. We want to follow the client's cue on language that they use. This can help us know about pronouns. This can also help us know about how they identify themselves. And it can show them that we're listening and that we are responding with comfort to the language that they're using to describe themselves and their own situation. If you take nothing else from this presentation, here's the takeaway. The phrase, "What does that mean to you?" is going to get you miles and miles with clients. There are lots and lots of words and language that the LGBTQ community uses to describe themselves, to describe sexual identity, to describe gender identity, etc. And there are always new words. I work with teenagers currently. There are always new lingo being introduced, people using a different language to introduce themselves. I think it's great. I love it. If there's words that help you feel more seen and more identified, great. Also, none of this is new. LGBTQ people have been around all throughout history. It's only that recently we're able to be seen and to be identified and to find language that describes our experience. So if a client comes in and uses a term that you don't know or are not familiar with, what does that mean to you is an excellent way to respond, right? It opens up a conversation about it. It shows that we're curious, and it shows that we're not making assumptions about that person's story. If the client identifies as transgender or intersex, that is how we describe a person, a transgender person or an intersex person, right? Transgender is a description. It's not a noun. So it's not, I'm going to say this, but please don't ever say that. It's not a transgender, right? That's not right. It's a transgender person. We also don't say transgendered or intersexed, because that's not something that is done to someone. It's just a part of their identity, right? That like ED language. Transgender person, transgender man, intersex woman, etc. The term hermaphrodite is outdated. It was something that was used in medical terminology to refer to intersex people often. That is not a term we use anymore. It will show up in older literature sometimes, and I encourage you to see it for the time period that it was and know that, excuse me, intersex is the term that we use now. If someone's name on your chart is different than the name that they use, the name that they use is their real name. There is not one name that is more real than another. Many trans and non-binary people, as well as other people for other reasons, change their name either legally or socially to better represent their identity. That is their real name. That is real to them, and that's the name that we should be using. If it is necessary in the provision of services to document their legal name, or even more specifically, the name that is listed on whatever documents we're doing. So when I communicate with doctors and I'm talking about a trans client, I will use that person's name. And then if I need to send a referral over or something in the chart, I will say client name, and underneath it, I will say name listed on insurance, because that's really the information that they want, right? That doesn't make it any more real. It's just being specific about where it's listed. Obviously, we're not using slurs of any kinds. That's part of why I was sharing some of the language that has changed. We're not making assumption about identities. And another one, we want to avoid overly clinical language. This is, so for example, if a client, this is following the client's definition of themselves. If a client identifies as gay, then we want to use the term gay. If they say gay and we say, so you identify as a homosexual, right? Like that sort of overly clinical language, though not inaccurate, communicates discomfort to our clients, right? We want to follow their lead. Whatever the language they use is going to be the language that they're comfortable with, right? And not trying to make it, I don't know, flowery and fancy and like, oh, I'm very professional. That's how it can feel, right? It can be a little bit disconnecting to our clients as opposed to staying connected to them. Here's some examples of things that are better left unsaid that we may not have thought about, right? This was an old one, but like, who's the boy? Who's the girl in the relationship? The graphic shows a fork and knife asking a pair of chopsticks, which one of them is the fork? What a silly question. Neither one of them is the fork, right? They're both chopsticks. That's similar when we're asking this about a relationship of people who may be same-gendered or people who may be non-binary, et cetera. We already talked about this idea of real name. The name a client uses is their real name. Asking about people's bodies, unless there is a medical reason and you are providing services based on that medical reason, is always inappropriate. So asking a person who you know to be transgender or non-binary about any sort of surgical operation or gender affirming surgeries, referring often to chest or genitals, is none of your business, right? If you are that person's doctor or that person's sex partner, then sure, that's relevant information. Other than that, that information changes nothing about how you work with that person or their identities, right? Because having any surgical operation or any other affirming intervention at that point doesn't change that person's identity. Those procedures are meant to make it easier for that person to exist with their body more in alignment with their identity. But again, it's none of our business where they're at in that process, unless it's part of the service that you are providing to that client. People say this a lot. I would have never known you're trans. I would have never known you were gay. And they often mean it as a compliment. But what we're actually doing with that kind of phrase is reinforcing the idea that there's something different or wrong about those identities and that people should be able to blend or pass into sort of mainstream society, right? I identify as a gay man, and I think that people should know that. I think that that's a very important part of who I am. It's certainly not all of who I am, but it's an important part of who I am, both as a service provider, as a person, as a friend, etc. And so telling someone, oh, like I would have never known, means we're like reinforcing this idea that they can pass in straight society. And that's not valuable, because society is better when we have a blend of identities and a blend of points of view. Also, another way we reinforce these stereotypes is talking about masculinity, femininity, and how this lines up. We see this a lot with lesbian women, for example. Like the stereotype is that some lesbians are very masculine in their presentation, and some lesbians are very masculine in their presentation. Some of all different identities are very masculine in their presentation. And so commenting like, oh, but you're so femme, is just reinforcing those stereotypes. A reminder, there's information that we need to know, but it is not okay to pry into clients' lives because we want to know. All right, it's useful. I'm a mental health provider, but it is useful to keep in mind the impact that being an LGBTQ person in our world right now has on the mental health of our clients, even if that's not the specific focus of our care. So first of all, sexuality and gender identity, all of the identities we're talking about today are not disorders. They are not diagnoses, and they are not treatable. These are not things that are a problem. These are not things that we should be trying to change. The mental health impacts of these identities come from how the culture, society, and other people treat people in marginalized communities. Today, we're talking about LGBTQ, but in these cases, we could be talking about lots of other marginalized communities, poverty, BIPOC communities, etc. The impacts are a little different, but just from having that identity, it makes things more difficult. So we have a lot of evidence to show that LGBTQ people in the community are at much increased risk from rejection and isolation from their families, increased risk for suicide. LGBTQ people on the whole, 30%, so almost a third of the community has made an incomplete suicide attempt at some point in their life. When you take just the transgender and gender nonconforming community, that number jumps to 50%. Half of all the people that are alive right now who are transgender or gender nonconforming have made suicidal gestures. In the general population, it's less than 10%. That is disproportionate and is a big part of why it's important that we know how to support LGBTQ clients that come to us for services. Substance use issues are much higher among the LGBTQ community. Part of this is that there's a historical normalization of drinking and drug use in several parts of this community. It's also a coping skill for being a marginalized community in this country, and that people use that to cope and with some of these other issues, right? So knowing that substance is likely a part of someone's story, not making assumptions, but being curious. We want to be screening for that. Depression and anxiety, really high in the general population, especially anxiety. I saw a number that since COVID, like 40% of young people qualify for a diagnosable anxiety disorder. That is a huge number. And it's always been high among LGBTQ people. Again, difficult to exist as a marginalized person leads to negative mental health impacts. Homelessness, 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ. Many, I don't have the numbers, but many adult homeless people also identify as LGBTQ. And the problem with this is that our shelter system and our homeless services and our underhoused services programs aren't always equipped. They're often gender segregated. They're often very, very traditional in their service provision. And that doesn't always capture everyone who might be in the LGBTQ community, though it's a huge portion of who is needing those services. And we also have evidence that over half of the people who identify as LGBTQ plus are survivors of trauma, either directly or witnesses to it. Again, this is much higher than a much more general population sampling. That being given, this is also a very resilient community. When I say resilient, we talk about resilience, we're talking about doing well while still in pain, right? So I'm not okay, like everything isn't fixed, but I am still moving forward with my goals. I still deserve to be okay in my life and to continue on that journey. That's what I mean by resilience. Resilience is positively correlated to a supportive home environment and positively correlated to a lower risk of anxiety and depression. This is for young people from the Trevor Project, but also applies to adults. We talk about a home environment. We also talk about social supports, right? LGBT identity itself can be a form of resistance, acting as a source of strength. Identifying a marginalized identity in ourselves can take some strength, some courage, social connection to another community, right? And personal growth, learning more about ourselves. All right, so I want to go back to this legislation piece and keep in mind that we're talking about this because it affects the clients that we serve. There are two big areas that are currently being legislated in LGBTQ sources, and that's because the transgender community is being targeted by legislation. The first is the bathroom bills, and this has been around for the last 5-6 years. And we saw this in a couple of states that made laws that people were only allowed to use bathrooms that align with their sex assigned at birth as defined by what's on their birth certificate. So if your birth certificate says M, you can only use men's bathrooms. This was obviously unenforceable because no one carries their birth certificate with them, but was meant to target the trans community as a way of limiting their rights and providing control. This is not about who uses what bathrooms. The argument that we heard was that often men, and in that example, it's transgender women, are trying to gain access to women's spaces in order to perpetrate violence. Documented predatory behavior from transgender perpetrators in bathrooms does not exist. This has never happened. And there was no basis for that argument. It was a fear tactic, right? Protecting women and children has often been a way of inspiring change and inspiring fear to accomplish a certain legislative task. And so this message of like protecting women in bathrooms was effective, but is based on nothing. There's no evidence that this has ever happened. In fact, trans people are way more likely to be a victim of violence in any of those situations. And transgender women of color are still the most likely identity combination to be experiencing hate crimes and violence throughout their life. The other legislation that we're seeing is about athletics. I mentioned this in Iowa, the transgender sports ban. All of the major sports entities don't support this ban, and there's no evidence that there's any sort of trans women taking over women's sports, right? So there's no direct or consistent research on trans people having an athletic advantage over their cisgender peers. We do see, we hear occasionally about a trans woman who has, there was a swimmer, I can't remember her name right now, but she won some competitions earlier this summer. She didn't break any records, but she did win. But this double standard is like, if a cis woman had won, there would not have been this conversation about why and how, right? But this trans woman won, and it was like, oh, she must have cheated. Oh, she's actually this, that, or the other thing. It's really inconsistent languaging. The NCAA openly opposes transgender sports bans, and the International Olympic Committee also opposes them. Although the Olympic Committee does do some like testing and like verifications of like their athletes. So they do say they oppose it, but they also implement some invasive procedures for verification. So again, these kinds of legislation are targeting a vulnerable, marginalized population as a way to gain political points with their base and as a way to control a smaller marginalized population. So I point this out because these are laws without problems, right? Like there's not a problem that they're addressing. It's about an agenda. All right. All right, we're kind of jumping around. I apologize. So that was the legislation piece. Now let's talk about identity development. This is important for the people that we are working with, right? Identity development is usually called coming out, which I hope most of you are familiar with that term. Coming out is a psychosocial process, meaning it has a mental, psychological part, getting to know ourselves, growth, and a social part, how we share that with other people, right? And adolescents are experiencing this development younger and younger, often by high school. There's a sense of these identities crystallizing. This is a change from 20, 30 years ago when it was much later in life, maybe college or later. We will still see clients who might be adults and might be coming to grips with their own identity later in life for many reasons, right? Maybe that was a part that they were not aware of. Maybe it was a part that they never felt like they could embrace. Therefore, they packed it away or kept it secret or have been living a life in one way and now are wanting to live something else, right? This does happen. And so it's important to know the steps. Before someone comes out, they are using defense mechanisms to prevent their recognition of this identity, right? Or if they are aware of their identity, they're using it to keep it hidden, to keep it down. This costs us in emotional and psychic, mental energy. It takes a lot of energy to keep something like that in, to always be on our guard about how we're presenting ourselves, what we're saying, keeping our stories straight. That takes a ton of energy. And that is the primary relief that comes from sharing your identity, coming out to the people in your life or the world at large. That amount of energy is no longer required, and we can put it into whatever else we want, right? Usually there's a period of experimentation that happens either sort of openly or secretly, looking for roles, looking for identities, looking for language that might define or help a person understand their own identities as they're learning about this. Again, this often happens in adolescence, but can happen for people anywhere along the life span. And then what's coming out, we're looking for a normalization experience, an understanding of you are still the person that you've always been. I am still the person that I've always been. This is a part of my identity that I now understand, and I live and accept the roles that come along with that. That's often the process that we can support clients in going through, and knowing where they are in that process is really helpful in sort of goal setting in the short term. This is another example of how to think about identity development. It's instead of being such a stepped process, these are tasks, right? So once we exit heteronormativity, right? This is straight, not transgender. Once we exit that, then we have to do these 5 things. Develop our personal identity. Who am I as an LGBT person? Develop a social identity. Who am I in relation to other people as an LGBT person? We need to become an LGBT offspring, which means our identity as a child. We all have parents. Our identity as a child who is queer, right? Our intimacy status. So this is about sexuality and dating. Who am I as a queer person dating, if that's something I want? And where do I find community with people who are like me, and also with people who may not be like me, but are part of my support system. So these are all tasks that we can help clients work with, and don't imply developmental order. It's just all of the tasks need to be accomplished. This was an idea put out by a researcher named Doug Ellie in the 90s, actually, and is still showing us, it's still a useful framework to use when thinking about kind of how to support people in the services that we're providing. Oh, I did it. Okay, this is great. So this is our role, right? We are providers and we are allies. So allies to a community often means someone who does not identify as LGBTQ, but wants to support a client who is. I identify as a gay man, I mentioned that, but I do not identify as transgender. I'm a cisgender man. So I'm a strong ally to the trans community, right? We all can be allies to communities that we are not a part of, and we can also be allies to the communities that we are a part of by supporting those around us. We want to support, we were just talking about coming out, we want to support clients in coming out when they're ready on their own timeline, and how to maintain safety while doing that. Again, the benefits that we get from that are relief of a lot of mental stress that comes along with having to maintain that secrecy. Advocating for LGBTQ rights, both at school and in the place of work. There are some protections for LGBT people, despite what I shared earlier about the laws and the proposals here in Iowa. Those have not been implemented yet. Both sexuality and gender identity are still protected classes against discrimination in hiring, in pay, etc. So advocating for those rights at work and at school are really important. We can help clients to find community that is reflective of their identities. Fortunately, many of you who are watching this will live in Johnson County and Iowa City. There are resources here. In some places, those resources are fewer, right? And so identifying online resources, identifying Zoom options, which is one of the few things that came out of COVID that was beneficial to us this right now. Being able to do things remotely is really, really beneficial, especially to rural communities. Rural communities also have LGBTQ people in them. And so being able to find a community, even in a small, primarily heteronormative community, is really valuable. Identifying or maybe even hosting events that are targeted at LGBTQ people, mixers, events, fundraisers, these kinds of things, helps to build community and show clients that we are interested in supporting this community. Learning about LGBTQ history. I mentioned these are not new identities. LGBTQ people have existed all through history. There is some documentation of this, but by and large, history is written by straight white men. And so then people who do not have straight white male identities, we get presented in the ways that those people want them to. So queer people have always been around. But they've been washed from a lot of history. But even starting with in this country, we think about Stonewall as being the beginning. That was June of 1969 in New York City. We think about that as being beginning of the queer rights movement. There's a lot of great history there, and a lot of it that we don't teach to young people or to anyone. In Iowa City, we have the LGBTQ archives, which is a library and resource for a lot of this information, and is a really cool space. But it's also important that we learn about this ourselves, because it's part of our shared history, right? Queer people have always been there. Again, learning about history through inclusive curriculum, right? So if we're working with young people or in a school or university setting, we want this to be a part of the curriculum, right? We don't want everything to be whitewashed. We don't want everything to be straight washed. We want to acknowledge the contributions of queer people all throughout history when we know about them and when we're able to. If a client is exploring identities, we want to support them in that, and we can support them by trying on things. I have clients that I've worked with in the past who change the name that feels comfortable for them frequently, change pronouns frequently. And so if someone is exploring their identity, we want to be a person who is very supportive of that. It costs us nothing to use a different name, to use a different pronoun, to interact with a person in a slightly different way, that if that's part of their learning process for themselves, it costs us nothing. And so being a person that they know they can try those things on and see how they feel, and it is a safe person for them, is really, really valuable, again, in the context of whatever service we're providing. And then, of course, advocating for anti-bullying and LGBTQ affirming policies at schools, at local governments, and at federal levels. And this is really important, as I mentioned, with all of the different bills that are being proposed in Iowa and in other states and in the country. We want to be clear with our clients that we support them and that we don't support limiting their rights or their access to resources. And we also, to the extent that we're able, want to take action to advocate for our clients in governmental roles. That's our job as social workers, as mental health professionals, and as client providers. So I think that's it for me. End of slideshow. Click to exit. Great. So that's it for me. I really, really appreciate your attention in all of this. I know I'm sort of speaking into the void. That's how it feels in these Zoom situations sometimes. But I'm hoping that there's some stuff that came out of that for you. Does anyone have any questions or anything they'd like me to go more into, or questions at the time? Small group, so opportunity for some personal attention.
Tim, that was super. Thank you so much. One question I had was, you mentioned transstudent.org and then the LGBTQ archives. Are there any other local resources that we should be sharing, kind of just more broadly with our organizations?
Oh, sure. So let's see. A lot of the stuff I know about is youth focused because that's my work currently. So, you know, a lot of schools in the university has the LGBTQ clinic. So that's the clinic for healthcare, physical healthcare for LGBTQ identified folks. That's out at River Landing, out by the hotel in Coralville. The university also has an LGBTQ house where they do like support for students, but also have like a library of resources, those kinds of things that are available. I know there's several places in Cedar Rapids and the Quad Cities that do work with young people. Tanger Place has a LGBTQ like drop-in space maybe around Cedar Rapids, and then the Quad Cities, it's called Clock Tower Place, I think. Sorry. There are a lot of them. And I can do better about putting a list of or some of that together and sharing that with you if that'd be helpful.
Sounds great. Thank you. John, Tammy, any questions?
It's okay if not. I know how it is, like the one in the spotlight, you know. Okay.
All right, super. Well, thank you so much, Tim. That was a lot of really great information for us. We're excited to share out with those who weren't able to join us in person. Just a couple extra things I wanted to mention, some things we have upcoming. October. Whew, we're not there yet. August 31st, our peer group sessions resume. So that starts with the CEO group. Check them out on our website, get registered for those. It's our fall session. So last one of this kind of year. And then September 21st is our next ed session. So again, at noon virtually. And Shelley will actually be sharing with us some end of year giving tips. So join us for those two things. That's all I have for you all. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you all very much.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks so much, Tim. That was wonderful. Thank
My
you.
pleasure.